Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for everyone for inviting me here. I always suffer from massive imposter syndrome. Why am I here? This was reinforced when I quick looked at the feedback form. Please tick which applies to you. Journal editor? Nope. Other editorial role? Nope. Publisher? And so on. So I'm very grateful for being here. I head up a new team at Wellcome Trust called Open Research. I'm going to try and give you a sort of flavour of some of the things we're doing, and which I hope are relevant. Where's the next button? Oh dear, we're done here. Right, incompetence. So it's what I'm trying to talk about. I'm going to talk about what I understand as publication research, ethics, talk about what Wellcome are doing in this space. Then I thought, well, I better try and think of some things we could do next. So that's what I'm going to try and cover in the next 10 minutes or so. But just my understanding, I say I haven't studied COPE guidelines in detail. So I think from a funder perspective, what do we mean by sort of ethics in publications? So we want the research we have funded to be accessible, published in a reasonably timely manner. We've had quite a lot of discussion already, and my talk will reinforce some of this, the need for that content to be reanalyzable and reproducible. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about peer review and the sort of things we're developing around encouraging the post-publication peer review. And obviously we're trying to encourage, trying to remove the bias which we see in publishing. And something which has already been touched on this morning, which you can't ever escape from, is the need to disentangle the incentive issues and the publication problem. We know from all the studies which are done and just talking to people that the currency of the realm is still publications, and the need to publish, the desire to get publication numbers, particularly in branded journals, is potentially a real problem. So the first thing I'll start with, publication bias. I don't know if that graphic quite worked there, but that was meant to try and show you articles which get published. They were in the top bits when they have positive results, so the clinical trials, and when they don't have such a positive result, those articles don't tend to get published. This was analysis of FDA data. So the data is there, but it's sort of hidden away in FDA, and if you just rely on sort of PubMed and that sort of tool to try and find this, you don't know they exist. So publication bias is a problem. And I saw a tweet yesterday which came out of the World Health Organization annual summit thing, and they reckon about half of clinical trials are never published, which is a staggeringly high number. And I thought that comment this morning about predatory journals, and I don't want to reopen all that again, but when someone said, oh, predatory journals are publishing clinical trials, I thought, well, thank God somebody is then. Anyway, so let's not get into too much trouble here. Let's talk about some things Wellcome's doing. So our policies to try and support good publication practice. So obviously open access, I'm not going to spend any time on that. Data sharing, we've had a policy in place for over a decade now, which sets an expectation that researchers should maximize the availability of data. And specifically, we say that the data underpinning that publication must be made available at the time of publication. And as something Ian was talking about, the need for researchers to start thinking about how they're going to share data at the very start of the process, at the point of applying for Wellcome funding. What we do, we ask them a question in essence, which says, are you going to generate any data which might be of use, and to others? And if you tick the box yes, then we ask you a supplementary question. Okay, tell us how, and we ask them to develop a data management plan. And particularly on public health emergencies, all the worry last year around the Zika virus and Ebola, and setting an expectation that in these circumstances, don't wait until a publication happens, but share that data as soon as it's ready to be shared. So that's one thing we do on our policies. And then specifically, just I did mention clinical trials already, but I think they're such an important publication type. So we're requiring that the trial must be registered, and summary outputs should be shared. We just recently signed up to this WHO statement, which again requires signatories to this to make sure that summary data from clinical trials are shared through registries like clinicaltrials.gov. And we're just at the point of updating our data sharing policy. And we're going to move away from calling it a data sharing policy to outputs. So data is obviously really, really important, but there's other types of research materials, particularly things like software and biological materials. So we're looking to basically extend our policies. So that's what, extend our scope of our policy. And then I want to talk about researcher evaluation, which is the big thing. And we know that the desire, the need to publish, the publish or peril dilemma, can again lead to researchers to publish the more positive outcomes. So in terms of evaluation, for a long time we've had this open access policy. I don't know if you can read that language clearly enough, but it talks about when we come to evaluate you as a researcher, it's the intrinsic value of what you've done and not the venue of publication. That's what we say. We try and reinforce that a bit. This screen grab on the right-hand side talks about some of the. This is a screenshot from the guidance we give to our panel review members. Remember, the actual reviews are done by the peers, not by Wellcome staff. And then we chair those meetings, and again we try and encourage those panelists to make sure that they focus on the content and not things like the publication name or things like the number of publications. There's much more we need to do in this space. So I know, for example, that Wellcome, despite saying this, still has a question on most of its application forms which says, and how many publications have you published? If it's not important, why are we asking it? So I think there's still much more work to be done. But what we're doing is common with other people, but I think the ref is the example here, but we need to obviously do more in this space. And I think this is the single biggest problem. If we can't get researcher evaluation to recognise the value of other outputs, then all the other work we're trying to do, I think, will fail. This is the single biggest challenge. But we've also developed some platforms. I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about a couple we've done. So the one I'm most closely associated with is a new platform we've developed in partnership with F1000. And if you know the F1000 research model, you know this, because this is their platform with our branding on top of it. And it's a platform set up, and you have to be in the Wellcome Club to be able to use it. So you have to be Wellcome funded. But as a Wellcome funded researcher, you can use this platform to publish any result you think worth sharing. And the issues we were trying to solve with establishing this was to try and make the sharing of research faster, more transparent, and I'll come back to this, but one of the things we discussed earlier was the peer review process. On this platform, it is completely transparent. It's author-led. Authors identify reviewers. Reviewers obviously have to declare any conflict of interest, but the reviewer, the reviews are published and they are signed. We're keen to support reproducibility, and again, there is an underlying requirement here that to publish on this platform, you need to make your data available. If in the case, we had a case a few weeks ago where someone was sharing some data which was behind a data access committee, so that data couldn't just be made publicly available. In that case, they developed like a reference set, which was publicly available, and then made it clear through the data availability statement how anyone else could get to the full data set. And the other thing is talking about sort of bias and things. We want to encourage the sharing of all research outputs. Now, we don't really have a figure on how much stuff potentially is publishable, but then doesn't actually get published. We all know of the file draw problem, where people have a hypothesis, they run an experiment, and it didn't really work, so they don't publish it. The Wellcome Open Research platform allows people to share anything. So this basically means that it's a platform for sharing data notes or negative studies, but also things like protocols. And one example I often talk about is someone had an article published, a researcher in The Lancet, and in The Lancet they had a methods section, and I believe they were limited to something like 400 words. So that is better than 140 characters, but it's still quite small. So in that case, the researcher decided to publish a separate paper, which is the detailed protocol. Now, it's not the most riveting read, it's not really a great narrative, but I would argue that in the future, if anyone wanted to try and reproduce that study, they've got a very, very detailed recipe book of all the steps they took, and what the weather was doing, and all that sort of stuff, all the special stuff which makes that particular research what led to those results. So I think trying to encourage that type of publication, and another thing we were concerned with, to keep costs affordable. So I've already talked about, but the thing I really want to focus on is the peer review process. So this process is, so on submission, a paper goes through a series of checks. So they make sure the data availability statement is there, and if the data has got a URL, make sure it resolves there. The article is put through a plagiarism detection system, and if it's passes that, all the authors are pinged to make sure they're authors. So all the standard stuff you guys do, in a matter of course, we do on this platform. And as soon as it passed those tests, it is published. And at that point of publication, it has a citation, Wellcome Research, with a DOI. So it's a formal publication. And at that point, that is when the peer review process starts. And you can reasonably clearly see that the status of any article is self-evident in the title of it. So the title of this article includes the version number and the current status, and that's updated dynamically, and gives you like a visual clue as to the status. So all these ticks means it sort of had 4 people who have reviewed it and have approved it. Sometimes it has a question mark, which they say it needs further work. It's sort of approved with reservations in the language. So it's clearly, so I think in terms of like COPE, it sort of clearly indicates the current status of the peer review paper. And one thing we're finding, I'll just show you some examples, probably weren't very clear. But one of the concerns we had from the get-go was, does this just encourage the old boys network? Am I more likely to go and ask my friends to review a paper? They'll give me less grief than someone else. What was a concern. But I think what we're seeing, and the numbers are relatively small, we've published about 70 papers. We launched it in November last year, so what's that, 6 months or so. But we're clearly seeing that reviews, people don't seem to be afraid to speak their mind. I don't know if you can read that one, but you probably can't. Believe me, it starts off, "It pains me to write this." And he goes on talk about the study being underpowered, the hypothesis being flawed, and so on. So the fact that it's open, I would argue, probably encourages slightly more honesty, because they're putting their name to this. So if downstream it was turned out this article actually was nonsense, it's better if you said up front, I think this is nonsense. So we're seeing all types of reviews that they're pretty detailed, so a sense that people just say, yeah, this looks good enough. That hasn't come to pass. And I say when reviewers do 2 things, they obviously review the article and they critique it and so forth, and then they assign it one of these statuses, approved or not approved, or approved reservations. And again, people are not afraid to use the not approved. And the nice thing about this platform is that it is very much researcher-led. So the researcher can decide, I don't care if I've got all these red crosses, I'm done. But obviously they are probably motivated to try and get these red crosses changed to question marks or to ticks. And so this platform does allow, and it talks to a comment someone made earlier, that science is continually evolving. So it allows you to publish version 2. That goes through the same process, version 3, and so on. So obviously an author can decide enough's enough, but in theory a paper can go on being edited forever. So I think it's an interesting model. And I say it publishes a range of publication types and protocols, methods, software. And we require these availability statements, which makes it clear how you can actually get hold of the stuff which is used. And we're starting to explore the idea of reproducible code in it. So F1000 have already built into some of their articles is something called Code Ocean widgets, which I'm now massively out of my depth on. But effectively, it's a cloud-based platform to allow you as a reader or a reviewer to try and computationally check that the data produces the same answers as have been produced in the paper. So we're looking to extend that functionality to Wellcome Open Research. And just say we're also, so another sort of another area we're pushing is around preprints. So for example, one of the things we did earlier this year was change our grant application process. And again, this actually was just updating our policy to reflect what was happening already. So researchers were already citing preprints, but we didn't really formally recognise them, and now we're saying people can actually cite preprints. And again, I think that's a welcome development. We know there's a huge growth in preprints in biology, but again, they do raise real challenges because obviously these are not peer-reviewed. So how do we make sure that dangerous stuff doesn't get published? So one of the things we're hoping to do there is work with a community of funders, and one thing we're planning to do, but maybe it's been overtaken by the announcement that Chan Zuckerberg initiative are getting involved in this space. But one of the things we recognise we need, irrespective of who builds it, is a way to automate, or to screen content in a way which is far more automated. So bioRxiv, which is probably the leading life sciences preprint server, at the moment when submissions go in, humans review their content, and they're basically asked, if this gets published, could it harm someone's health? And so that's really the question, as simple as that, and there are humans doing it. And because the numbers with bioRxiv, though they're growing massively, the actual total numbers are relatively small still. We're talking about 800 to 1,000 submissions a month, so they can manage that. But if that starts to grow, then we will not be, that system or any other would not be able to screen them with humans. So we need to sort of develop tools which can, if nothing else, say, okay, this one seems to be talking about, I don't know, some CRISPR technology, it should be published. This one mentions the word vaccines and drug dosages and human clinical trials, so lots of red flashing lights. Human needs to look at this. So finally, I think obvious things perhaps we could think about doing is encouraging publishers to develop data sharing policies, and I think there's some good examples out there. I think PLOS and Spring, you heard from Ian, Springer Nature leading the way. I think, I would like to see at a minimum, publishers having a data sharing policy. And I thought that data Ian showed again about the data availability statements. It seemed to me that would be like a minimum, I think, a good practice. Just as you all pretty much have conflict of interest statements, having a data availability statement, I think, would be an excellent first step. And okay, it may take 10 minutes, and therefore that may incur greater costs. But I suspect the costs of not having that, and then that data not being available, or not being, at least not having an availability statement, cost downstream could be higher. And the other thing we're exploring, we talked about the incentives, and obviously we're trying to encourage data citation, but there is a sort of a growing call that's come out of a lot of work which Jeff Drazen and the NEJM and colleagues are doing, is whether or not there should be specific data authorship. So if you use my data, I don't need to be an author on your paper, I may not even agree with your conclusions, but I would be cited as a data author, and there's certainly a growing interest in that. So I think that's sort of worth exploring. My concern about that a little bit is that, again, it just reinforces it puts the journal articles again as being the only currency which has any value, and I think we should value people's data sets. I think are valuable, software is valuable, but I think as an initial step to encourage the citation of to encourage people to share data, I think it's worth doing. I've gone on too long, so I will stop there. Happy to answer questions of everyone else. Thank you.